Gray, we are live here. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Yourself?
I'm doing well. Welcome, everyone, to another live episode of the Expect Miracles podcast. You can view these episodes live on Facebook and YouTube. You can stream them on Apple, iTunes, Spotify, podcast playing platforms everywhere. Thank you, everybody, for listening and tuning in. And we have a phenomenal episode ready for you today. We have Dr. Josh Gray. He is a phenomenal upper cervical doctor in Pleasanton, California, and it's an honor to have him on the show. Dr. Josh, how are you today?
Good. Can't complain. It's a Friday, and it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
And for everybody wondering, that is a real backdrop, not fake. It fooled me. It looks beautiful over there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a little bit gloomy for a California day, but just means I'm not backlit.
Yes, exactly. So, Dr. Josh, I love asking people, first of all, where you're from, and second of all, how you got into upper cervical chiropractic, because not many people do, and it's a phenomenal profession to be in. So, Josh, where are you from originally?
Yeah, so most people don't know that I was born in Groton, Connecticut. And then my dad was in the Navy and then got us stationed in South Georgia. So that's where I grew up, and most people associate with me with growing up in Georgia. Well, that is actually how I got involved in like chiropractic. So
Georgia.
We were a chiropractic family, and I grew up like with a lot of allergies and always sick and on a lot of antibiotics.
Oh yeah,
and
me too.
my mom like started having these headaches, and finally someone said to her like, hey, like there's this chiropractor you should go see. So she like made an appointment and she started seeing him, and she's like, I really don't understand it, but she was getting relief. She got better. And that's kind of how I was introduced to chiropractic. And it wouldn't be until like, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years later that I would actually go to chiropractic school, and then, the rest is history.
That's such an interesting, I love the domino effect chiropractic has on not only the patient, but the entire family. I mean, you saw your mom was probably suffering for a while with headaches, and you got your mom back, and it changed the whole dynamic of the family, and it made the whole family healthier and put you on the path you're on today. Who would have thought?
Yeah. It's funny because I can remember, being like a kid and a teenager. I can see even now people's like headache eyes where like they're just out doing whatever their daily lives and they have headache eyes. And, it's one of those things that, you always hope that they find like chiropractic and upper cervical, because there's a lot of relief there. A lot of success.
Absolutely. It's interesting too when people come into the office with those, that's a good way to put it, headache eyes. Their world is just, their eyes are shut, it's gloomy, and then you deliver a nice specific adjustment, you rest them, they come back and it's open, the light's back in their eyes, and it's such a phenomenal thing to see.
Yeah.
Dr. Josh, I did some research on you, and before chiropractic school, you were in another profession, right?
Yeah, so I've actually done a lot of things. I did my undergrad in business, and then I had like worked abroad for 6 months.
Where at?
Qatar.
Qatar. Oh,
yeah.
I couldn't even point to that on the map. Where is that?
So it's in the Middle East, next to Saudi Arabia. And so,
how did you end up there?
I knew someone.
That's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And I was just open to the opportunity, which, it's kind of like one of those things that I think when folks are not born into chiropractic, they can fall into it based on being a patient, or like, we had said, like my mom being a patient and family and whatnot. And so, I ended up, when I came back to the US, I didn't want to live in the South. And so I moved to California. Well, like worked in tech and then healthcare tech. And then I had a friend that had like a healthcare crisis. And that's when I finally like stepped back and I was like, I think I want to do more in healthcare than just be like on the tech side of things. So then that's when I went back to school. And then so it was super convenient that like Life West was like basically in my backyard to go to. So I didn't have to relocate again. The cruel irony is that my undergrad was literally like next door to Life University. So
okay.
it's kind of like it
And
was always there waiting on me. I just had to be ready.
yeah. And Josh, as you know, there are several different avenues you can jump in when you get to chiropractic school. What made you land on upper cervical and become an upper cervical doctor?
So obviously I was a little biased knowing that my mom had gotten, success from an upper cervical doc.
That was upper
And
cervical in Georgia.
yep, it was.
Okay.
I believe it was Grostic. I know if he
Great.
ends up like seeing this or whatnot, he'll be like, "Oh, you should know." I believe it was Grostic, and so I went in being like, "Oh no, that's all I'm going to do." And throughout my time in school, I practiced, all of the electives for upper cervical. I put myself under care of all of the various techniques, and really like sought something that resonated with me, that made sense to me, so that it wasn't work. It didn't like I have to fight it to make it make sense, or fight to like figure it out. And so once
Yeah.
it clicked, and I found Blair and I was under Blair care, then I was like, this is what's for me for sure.
And Dr. Josh, you published an interesting research paper. Was that pretty recently? Or was
So
that a while
recent is
ago?
relative. It was, I believe, 2018 or 19.
Very nice. And it's
Yeah.
a very cool study. It's the reduction of symptoms in Meniere's and trigeminal neuralgia. And if you read the paper, one of the most beautiful things about it is there was one Blair adjustment that was delivered throughout the care with support work with Thompson technique. Is that
Yep.
correct?
Yep.
That's a beautiful thing. When I don't know any other adjustment or technique or that could really, you put somebody back into alignment once and the body continues to heal. That's such a beautiful thing. That's I think what's so beautiful about the upper cervical work.
Yeah. No, I think what's phenomenal is that, yes, we were using Blair and like supportive care for that patient in that case, but what Blair focuses on is how different everyone's anatomy is. And everybody's system is unique to them. And so that worked amazing for that patient. And we, hope to replicate it. And that's why we take the x-rays in Blair. But then there are some people that, even as light as the Blair adjustment is, like it may be too much for their system, right?
Yes,
And so
agreed.
that's why we leverage like the upper cervical network of chiropractors to say, okay, well, what other techniques are even lighter than Blair, maybe, right? So even Nuka. And so then maybe a patient can get relief for that. And so it's really about finding like what works for them. And that patient did have phenomenal results. So it was exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's I have a couple patients that sometimes the drop headpiece can be a little bit too much, and then you have sometimes we'll have to use the TRT instrument that's really light, that's got the little torque in it that clears them out really well. So other upper cervical docs, you got to find something to help all your patients. Sometimes people need something a little bit different.
Yeah, one of the things that Dr. Forrest taught me was some patients where the drop of the table is a little bit too much. There's the little like pediatric speeder boards that patients can be on. Yeah.
So he puts grown adults on the pediatric piece.
Yep. So depending on like, again, their anatomy, their systems, it's one of those things that I think that's what makes, research and the different upper cervical societies so important, is that they can actually, investigate that and then standardize it across, it just being something that you figure out and test. Right. And so I think, again, like that's why those that volunteer for like the Blair Upper Cervical Society and that published research, it allows people to figure out like, okay, well, what can work for my patients when they're not getting results, and whether they do that directly or refer to an upper cervical chiropractor. I think it's the patient's what's important.
Absolutely. Shout out to Dr. Liz Hafer, who joined us in the comments section. They said they're watching, and the I don't even know. There's so many the DCCJP, the cervical junction. What do you call that, Josh?
It's the upper cervical diplomate of the craniocervical junction, I think.
There we go. Shout out to them down there in Florida. They're doing some great work. Josh, you so for those who Josh just mentioned Dr. Tom Forrest, who is considered pretty much the godfather right now of the Blair technique. He's amazing, and Josh gets to work with him on a daily basis. Josh, what have you picked up from Dr. Forrest, and how has he just made you a better upper cervical doctor?
You know, I think the thing that I would highlight to folks is he taught me how important patient education is.
Mm.
And I'll say this. So I was lucky enough to, I shadowed his office as a student. And I think, anyone that's shadowed him knows that they go and do the markups and on the x-rays, and it's all about the x-rays, because if the x-rays are wrong, like your adjustment's probably not that accurate.
You can do a beautiful adjustment, and if it's the wrong segment or the wrong way, that person's not going to feel too good.
Yeah. And so after all of that, I had finished kind of my clinic responsibilities in school, and I had the opportunity to be under a preceptor. And so I asked him, and he said yes. So I was like super ecstatic about that. And in that preceptorship, I never adjusted. I joked I was his 130-pound shadow, and I'd be in the room with him when he was talking to patients. A lot of my, peers were like, "Oh, you're not adjusting. Like, how is that?" and everything. And I was like, "That's, it's fine by me," because I really learned, the goal is that we adjust them once or very few times and they hold. So then everything after that, and what keeps them coming back to get checked and understanding what's happening in their bodies, and then how they can communicate that to others so they can get that, results as well, is education. So I think above everything, and I think that's why Dr. Forrest continues to teach. So anyone that's lucky enough to be in an elective, reset an elective, do the trainings, just keep soaking it up.
Absolutely. I think it's huge that patients need to be continually educated about the healing process. Because every now and then you'll adjust somebody, they feel great, and they're like, "Oh no, I'm good," and they disappear for a little bit. It's like, we're so glad you're feeling great, but we want that to continue. And I think you missed the point that we there's ebbs and flows through the healing process. You do a lot of good healing 3, 6, 9 months in, so we want to continue to monitor you. So that must have been amazing, just being able to watch Dr. Tom Forrest educate patients. And I'm sure you pick up a lot of great things on the adjustments, the x-ray readings, difficult, cases, that upper cervical care we all see.
Yeah, I think, that's one of the things of being with someone that's also so experienced, is like some of the cases that, being a new doc, like you're like super nervous about, you're like, I don't know how to approach it. And then, he's like, "Oh yeah, I've seen this before, or seen some variation." And you're like, "This is what we're going to do." And that goes back to, like the speeder boards or the modifications in leg checks when, people have different issues going on. I think it's amazing. But, I think also, like for newer docs, especially people that are newer to upper cervical, sometimes the nervous thing is like, oh, the patient's going to be upset that I'm not adjusting them. And, I'll confess that sometimes, like, I get that nervousness still. I'm like, oh, they're going to be upset. And, it always amazes me when people are like excited, they celebrate, like, yes, like, one, obviously, they understand. And so we're doing our jobs. But I think it's something that newer docs need to realize. People will get there. You just have to be dedicated on the education aspect.
Absolutely. And what Dr. Josh is talking about with upper cervical, as he stated before, our goal is to do as few amount of adjustments as possible. So when somebody comes in, their scan looks good, their legs are balanced, and we say they're holding, it's a very good thing. It means their body's healing, and we don't want to interrupt the nerve flow that's already there. And I've had a couple patients that they've been holding, their scan looks good, and then like at the end of the visit, they're like, "So do I still have to pay today?" And it's like, I mean, I did my job. Like, you're holding, everything's looking good. I think Dr. Forrest even says, like, I should charge you twice because you're holding, or I should charge you double because you're holding, because that's the main goal, is to to have people holding is healing. So if you're balanced, you don't need adjustment. That's the biggest win in upper cervical.
Yep. And I think the more folks get educated and understand that, they're happy to pay, they're happy to be holding. And, the other thing that I think we highlight is, this kind of goes back to the education, is that in that visit, they're not just being told like, oh, you're holding, bye, have a nice day, right? It's like, are you doing your head and neck exercises? Or like, maybe they're holding and there's like other recommendations based on how they're presenting that we want to give them. And so they're walking away with that information as well as our expertise and saying, nope, you don't need an adjustment. You're good to go.
And there we see a ton of people that just have upwards of 20 neurological symptoms. They base their life around doctor's appointments, and upper cervical puts the power back in their hands to heal themselves. Once everything is in alignment and the interference is removed, you don't need anybody moving things around. You become your own doctor. Your body's healing by itself. And I think that's what's so beautiful about upper cervical, is because people have been told they're going to have to live with their condition or symptoms for the rest of their life. And once they start holding, and they can go on a maintenance schedule 2-3 weeks, and that adjustment will continue to work long after we give it. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. I think that's also why it's unfortunate that more folks don't get to hear about, upper cervical on the front end of their suffering and the kind of the issues that they're dealing with. And so that's why it's so great, like your podcast and all of the different resources that are out there for folks. I myself have had people come in and they're like, yeah, I heard about this on the internet, and they've tried 10,000 other things. And, I think we're always happy to like give them hope. And, title of your podcast, like Expect Miracles.
Absolutely. Dr. Josh, is there like a condition or ailment or symptom that really gets you fired up that you like to treat most in upper cervical?
So I would say,
I know we don't treat symptoms, but
yeah, I would have to say, it's like the constellation of or the label of fibromyalgia. I think, one, like that's, I've known like family and friends that have had it, and I know how like difficult that is. And so to be able to like lessen their symptoms, improve quality of life, get them as close to like living, optimally as possible. I think that's what always gets me fired up. And I also think it fires me up because those are the folks that oftentimes lose the most hope, because people just push them away. And sometimes they get pushed on medications that make them feel worse. And,
failed surgeries.
Like you said, we're not treating symptoms, we're not curing folks, but I can try to get you holding and getting you as close to your 100% as possible.
I would have to agree with the fibromyalgia one. People that walk in our door with fibromyalgia, they are in the most excruciating pain I have ever seen any human in. The wind blows too hard. It's too much on their face. Some people can't even wear the masks because just that sensation of them touching their face, sharp electric shock, shooting pain. They can't eat solid food. It's unbearable. It's an unbearable condition. And when somebody gets their life back through adjusting their upper neck, it's they start breaking down and crying tears of joy. And I know you've seen it, and that is one of the most beautiful things, upper cervical. I would have to agree with you on that.
One of the funniest stories, I think, was when I was working up in Spokane with Dr. Rashay Bell and Becky Ellis. There was this lady, she must have been in her 60s, that had fibromyalgia for probably like 40 years. And, she had been adjusted, been doing really well. She comes in and, you're always like, well, how are you doing? Kind of, gauging things. She's like, I feel terrible. And she'd been holding for so long. And I was like, we all kind of like, and she's like, I feel so good, I'm overdoing it. And so what a like exciting thing to be like, if you're going to feel bad, it's because you overdid it, like doing some like your hobbies or getting to enjoy life, not because you like feel bad. So that one always stands out to me as like one of those where someone's like, I feel bad. And then you're like, well, that's a good reason, because like, let's not overdo it. Right.
Absolutely. That's also a good point too. When some people are not holding as well as we'd like to see them. Sometimes we forget to take into account what they're doing outside the office. Is there any restrictions you guys put on patients a day or two after care, or maybe a couple weeks, a month or two in care to hold their adjustments?
So I think it always depends on like where they're at, right?
Yeah.
And the requirements also shift and change, just like someone's care and how frequently they get seen. It really
Hmm.
depends on, if you come in with like a triple whiplash history, like it's going to be a lot harder to hold. You literally like, some folks get excited, like it's no vacuuming, no heavy lifting, no
Yeah.
working with cast iron. And then so some for others, like when they're asymptomatic and they're healthy and they're like, you know, you know, kids and teenagers, their body has a lot more resilience. So, what would make you or I go out of adjustment would, they're unfazed. So I think it's really figuring out like, that's why you do a thorough history and exam to figure out, okay, here are our recommendations. And again, checking in on that visit to say, okay, how have you been doing? What have you been doing? And then, are you holding or not? And for those that aren't holding, you really have to like dig into, okay, what activities of daily living are you doing? What is your exercise like? Are you doing our head and neck exercise recommendations, sleep, etc.? It's kind of like you're a chiropractor and Sherlock Holmes trying to figure out what's making you go out.
Absolutely. I remember when I first started care, I felt like I needed to strengthen my neck right away, and I didn't tell Dr. Hall, and I was just doing like isometric exercises and chin tucks, and I was coming back and I was like, I don't know why I'm out. I'm not doing anything. And they're like, you're not doing anything? What are you doing outside the office? It's like, I'm just doing chin tucks. And they're like, some people can get away with that. Others, including yourself with a big trauma history, your muscles and ligaments are trying to mold around your adjustment. And when you're doing stuff like that in the very beginning, it's just going to have a tendency to go back where it's been for 15, 20 years.
Yeah. It's
So,
one of those things that I talk to folks. I'm like, it's kind of like slouching if you're out and feel better. Like you have to engage your muscles and you're like working at it. Like sometimes it gets tired and it's hard work, but that's the ideal. That's what you should be doing. But when you slouch, you're like, oh, I get that relief. Well, it's temporary and it's kind of damaging in a way. And so it's one of those things that just because you're like feeling better doesn't guarantee that you're in adjustment.
absolutely. When do your patients, would you say, reach like a maintenance type of care where you start to space them out and they're doing well? I mean, it's probably different than everybody, but is there like a 3-month mark, a 6-month mark where you kind of graduate stages of care?
Yeah, I would say like really you're looking at during the exam process, like when they are up for re-exam, that's when you're evaluating like how far can we stretch you out. And obviously like you have really good records so that you can kind of look over the time that we've seen you since your last exam, how have you been holding? And so for someone that's been adjusted once, their whole duration of, since their last exam, you're going to approach that a lot differently than you have to get adjusted every, twice every week, right? And it's
Mm,
super unfortunate when you do have those really tough cases where it's like they have to be adjusted so often. But it is the case that those exist, right? Our modern life is really tough on us. So
absolutely. Absolutely.
the other thing that I think, that makes me think of is you had asked about like recommendations. And so you're like, oh, well, you can't lift over 10 or 20 pounds. Well, then they say, well, I have dogs to walk or I have kids that I have to take care of. And it's like, these are our recommendations and the ideal state of getting you to hold. Life happens, but that's also why you get checked. Like we're here to like, if you go out, we'll get you back in.
Absolutely. And what do you guys do on your re-exams? What are you reevaluating?
We're going through all of like their positives. Like we're doing that like range of motion. We're doing grip strength. We're doing, obviously kind of the standard to check them for an adjustment as well. And so it also is, depending on if we've had to add any special exams based on their conditions or how they present, we're doing that as well.
And do you guys work with any other practitioners in the area to help facilitate healing, whether it be massage therapists, acupuncturists, anything that might help the healing or the holding process in your patients?
1,000%. And I think that's one of the things that's like where you see people really get to hold more is when they like do adjunct therapies and they are taking care of themselves. And so, we are, not curing any kind of conditions. We're not treating symptoms. And so the more diagnostics people can get, the more they can understand their bodies and see what's going on, the better. And I think it's phenomenal, the network that Dr. Forrest has built, not just within upper cervical, but full spine chiropractic, all different kinds of practitioners. We talk about the subluxation as like toxins, thoughts, and traumas. There are other people that know a lot about like troubled thoughts, toxins. Like, so whenever you start leveraging, especially for those tougher cases, that's when people are able to really hold better and longer.
Definitely. Do you guys work with any nutritionists by any chance?
So I wouldn't know of any. I haven't referred anyone to a nutritionist directly, but I think when
Neither have I, and I would wonder. I mean, obviously, it's a huge part of people's everyday life. I wonder how that would play into effect of the. I'm sure it would nothing but be beneficial.
Yeah. The other thing though is that I think it's super beneficial because, just as everybody's like body is unique and kind of their misalignments and their anatomy, it's like so are diets. Like I've had patients ask me, they're like, well, what do you do to work out and diet? I'm like, what works for me and like my body could be completely different for you. So I think, having a good nutritionist to refer to, or even a network, right, where they specialize in, nutrition pathology or, just standard or keto or whatever it is. I think that's really beneficial to have. So we should find some.
Yeah. And I'm starting to notice too, at a certain point, it's going to be hugely beneficial for the patient to start getting moving and exercise, because the people that I feel like sometimes don't do well are the people that are not doing anything. They're just sitting they're sitting at the desk all day. They're sitting in traffic. They're going home. They're sitting on the couch. There is no movement. There's no disc hydration or imbibition going on to keep that spine nice and healthy. And that is definitely a daily life factor that is plaguing us all. So I think at some point, movement has to be put into the treatment plan and talked about.
Yeah. I think movement's life, right? Like, you had talked about imbibition and like disc health, but, I talk to folks because, some people, under upper cervical care, they're like, they have dizziness or they can't be active. That activity
True.
level should be a spectrum, right?
Yes.
And
That's a good
truly,
point.
I think what you're hinting at is if people overdo it, they don't hold, right? They're outside of their spectrum. They underdo it. If they're not being active, even just a little bit, what may seem like minuscule to others, that's a perfect amount for them. When they're in that spectrum for them, they hold really well. And then when that, habit and routine goes out the door, right? They're like, oh, I stopped my gym routine and I've been really busy with work. They've stopped the movement, they've increased their stress, and now they aren't holding as well.
I really like that spectrum analogy. I'm going to start using that. And then you got things like sleep. Sleep is huge. A lot of people are not getting enough sleep, and it's very easy to dismiss these days, and that will throw everything off if you're not sleeping well.
Yeah. So actually that's one of the, I think sleep and relaxation, right? And, I've seen your prior podcast and you talk about the sympathetic nervous system when we're misaligned. And one of those things that I realized about myself is I'm always go, 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 right?
Oh,
and I'm always willing to like sacrifice sleep, even though I know what all the research says and how important it is. So what I did is I was like, well, I'll look at data and I'll believe that. So I started wearing this Aura ring, and it gives me metrics on like how well I slept and how well like my HRV is doing. And so when that number starts like ticking down, I'm like, all right, I gotta relax. I'm gonna skip the gym. I'm gonna sacrifice the movement so that I can like rest and recover. Right.
I
Back
like
in that
that.
spectrum of things.
So that ring is hooked up to like an app on your phone where you can monitor.
Yep.
Very cool. Technology is it's a beautiful thing sometimes these days.
Yeah. one day, like, you know, what I'd really like to see is people wear like an Oura ring, you know, again, like talking about like research or whatever, you know, a group of people start wearing Oura rings, make no lifestyle changes and get some metrics, and then start, you know, upper cervical care and see how, you know, their vitals change and how much easier
Absolutely.
like sleep scores are and things like that. And I think just being able to quantify in addition to qualifying like our results is really what it's going to take to get it more widespread, because there are people that, like, you know, feeling better makes sense to them, but whenever they can say, okay, well, I feel bad but my metrics are good, right? You know, how many other things in health do we talk about with metrics, right? Blood
Yeah.
levels, BMI, weight, all of that. Like, there's a number of people can ascribe to.
I already have patients doing that. They'll have either that thing that goes the whoop strap, or
Yep.
you know, whether it's a whoop strap or a ring, and they'll come in. They're like, my REM sleep has been off and my resting heart rate is up. I know I'm out, and then you're like, okay, relax, we'll see what's going on. And then sure enough, their scans off, and so there's definitely people that are getting very in tune with that, which is a very cool thing.
Yeah, I think, you know, it goes back to like the sympathetics and parasympathetics. And, you know, there are some people that, whether it's their symptoms or whatnot, you can kind of see a constellation come up of them being out. But I always say, like, look at your parasympathetics. If your stomach's upset and you're like, well, I didn't eat anything weird. If you're not sleeping well and like many days in a row, like that should be a red flag to get checked, because
Mm-hmm.
you're either on the way going out or you're already out.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yep, there is a lot of things to pay attention to, and yeah, and I think it's important to, you know, some people disappear for 6, 8 months in care, and they don't. Some of their symptoms start to come back, and they forget about upper cervical, and then they resurface like a year later, and they're like, I don't know what's going on. It's like, you haven't been checked in like a year. You were good before that. You know, you're probably out of alignment, and sure enough, they get back on track.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to everyone's journey is different. And sometimes like people can't be seen as often as they need to or should, because like they're
Very
going
true.
off to college, or
Hmm.
they're like, you know, there's so many different reasons and things going on in people's lives in today's world that we just have to meet them where they are. And I think that's where it goes back to the expectation of, you know, I've told patients, I'm like, all right, well, we need to see you on Monday.
Hmm.
And they're like, oh, like I can't. And it's like, that's okay. But you have to understand, like, we may not get the results that you want to see if you go out and then we see you on Wednesday, Thursday, whenever. So I
Hmm.
think it's just being real with the expectations. And when they can accept that and understand it, I think they respect us more for when they try to hold us accountable for when they're not holding.
Absolutely. And it kind of goes back to touching on what you said before, is everybody's got their own treatment plan. Everybody's got their own little spectrums in care. And I think when I first started out, I kind of just had, you know, everybody, I'm going to see you this, and this. And you have to make modifications for different patients. And if you tell your patients you want to see them, then most people are compliant and they want to get better, and they'll do it. Sometimes I was afraid. It's like, listen, to say, you know what, I think I want to see you next week a little sooner than expected, because I want to just make sure you're holding. Sometimes I would not say that because I didn't want to see what their reaction was. But now it's like, this is going to be best for you. Let's check you next week. I want to make sure you're holding and feeling better.
Yeah. And a lot of folks, you know, sometimes people will be like, you know, I'll say, all right, well, you know, schedule for Wednesday. And they're like, well, I want to come in Monday. And so it's one of those things that I think, you know, compared to some docs we know, we're both fairly new in practice.
Yeah.
It's people really want, when they get it and they start feeling better, they're like, I want to be sure I'm holding. And, you know, when they're like eager to come in and get checked and not adjusted and pay, they're like, you know, that's the light has gone off in their
Yeah.
awareness.
Absolutely. And if you think about it too, we're still seeing people way less than I'm a huge fan of anybody doing chiropractic, but some treatment plans are 3 or 4 times a week for 6 months. And, you know, that's not our goal. We're really not trying to see people 3 times a week at all. But so when you do ask your patient, you know, we're going to see you sooner rather than later, you got to think we're really not seeing you that much to begin with too. And it's really not that big of a burden to put on the patient because it's minimal visits over a long period of time anyway.
And that's what I tell folks when I ask to see them sooner. And, you know, sometimes they forget, like when they've been under care for like 10 or 20 years, they forget that when they started care, they were seen a couple more times a week than they were now. And it's like, based on how you're presenting, let's get it checked. And, you know, I always talk about like, it's like a plane taking off. If you keep that momentum and if you keep that holding, it's much easier to like keep it than if you're like, oh, well, I went out and I'm going to wait like a month for my appointment. It's like, no, like get seen sooner, get checked, get it corrected so you can keep that altitude.
Absolutely. And there's people that hold for months and maybe even years at a time. And then sometimes we hit these little speed bumps where you get extra stressed. You're not sleeping well, your jaw, something's going on at home. And you do need to, you know, we saw you maybe 6-8 times last year, but I want to see you once or twice over the next couple of weeks just to make sure you're back on track. Because if you're seeing a person once a month and you're adjusting them every time, you got to wonder how much holding is going on. So, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah. The thing that, you know, in school that really like made me aware of that is they were saying they're like, you know, people or accountants hold a less during tax season. And it was just like the light bulb went off of like, okay, they're more stressed, they're working more. And so then that's kind of the analogy I use to say, okay, if your work has increased demands, like you have to take better care of yourself. And, you know, I think then people kind of get it. They're like, oh, I guess I'm putting more demand on my body. So
it makes sense. It makes sense. So Dr. Josh, where can people find you online, website, social media, anything like that, if they want to schedule an appointment with you?
yeah, so they would go through like Forest Chiropractic in Pleasanton, and they would just look us up and give us a call, and you know, get scheduled, you know, for a new patient appointment.
Beautiful. And Dr. Josh, at the end of each episode, I like to ask all my guests, what is one piece of advice that has really resonated with you over the years that you would like to give the audience? Could be absolutely anything.
I think the best piece of advice I've ever been given is if it scares you, you have to do it.
Okay.
And it's that scared of like that nervousness, and that's the growth opportunity.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the things that in so many times I've been like scared, and sometimes I forget that advice. And then after the fact, once I've like committed and done it, even if it's a failure, even if it was tough, after the fact, the learning and the growth make it completely worth it. So
I agree. And sometimes that feeling or sensation can just eat away at your soul. Like you get so scared. And every time you think about it, just like, and you just do it and that feeling goes away and you feel so much better about yourself.
yeah.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for coming on. I would love to have you back on anytime. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Josh Gray, phenomenal upper cervical chiropractor in California. Please go see him if you're in the San Francisco area. You will be in good hands.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Josh. Have a great night, and I'll talk to you soon, okay?
Bye-bye.
All right.